Hi, everybody. Before we begin tonight's story, I invite you to take a deep breath, in through your nose and out gently through your mouth. Let the day slip away like mist retreating into the forest. You're not in your room anymore. You're somewhere older, stranger, softer. There's a cool wind moving through the tall grass and the sound of hooves far away like slow thunder rolling in the distance. Tonight, we're not telling just a story. We're slipping into a memory. One that might feel a little too vivid to be fiction, a little too quiet to be history. Tonight you will remember a life, your life, as Boudica, the Twilight Queen of misty Britannia. Now, I know what you might be thinking. Oh, I've heard of Boudica, fierce warrior, chariot rider, thorn in Rome's side. And yes, that's true. But that's not the story we're telling tonight. History books remember your fury. But your fire didn't begin with rage. It began with laughter, wildflowers, quiet pride, and long evenings where the smoke from the hearth carried songs into the trees. This is the life the historians skipped. The nights where you whispered to the moon, asked the river to share its secrets, and let foxes come close enough to steal your thoughts. This is the Boudica who was still a girl when the empire arrived, who felt the land humming beneath her bare feet, who fell in love with someone who saw her not as a queen but as a storm worth waiting for. So tonight, I want you to rest, not as a listener, but as the one living this memory, the one whose name would echo through centuries, but who once simply tried to teach her daughters how to whistle using blades of grass. Let us begin not with swords or smoke, but with a stretch of sky over the Iceni lands, a sky that never really changed, no matter how many Romans marched beneath it. You were born under that sky. The night you were born, the old midwife said the owls didn't hoot, and that meant power. Your mother, half laughing, half exhausted, said that if power meant louder lungs than the livestock, you were destined for the throne. They named you Boudica, which meant victory, but no one told you that for a long time. They just called you little fox because your hair was wild and your mischief wilder. You grew up not in palaces but in roundhouses that smelled of smoke, straw, and sage. Your earliest memory was lying on a woolen mat, watching the fire crackle upside down, the smoke painting dreams on the thatched ceiling. Your world was made of textures, rough cloaks, warm bread, muddy feet, and the occasional surprise of Roman iron glinting on the horizon. But don't worry, we'll get to the Romans. For now, let's stay in this twilight between girlhood and legend. You weren't afraid of the dark. In fact, you liked it, the way it held you, the way the stars never rushed. You believed the moon could speak if you just got quiet enough. And maybe it did. You remember one night long before anyone called you queen when you stood barefoot in the dew, arms outstretched, asking the sky if you'd ever matter? A shooting star passed overhead, slow and golden, as if answering, not just matter, change everything. That was before things got complicated, before alliances and betrayals, before swords were sharpened and vows were broken, before the fire in your belly had to become fire in your hands. We'll get there in time. But first, you need to remember who you were before history caught up to you. The girl who used to trade beetles for secrets with the village druid, who tried to teach a piglet to swim, who sat at the riverbank for hours watching reeds sway like they were dancing for her. That girl, that version of you, she still waits somewhere, in the quiet parts of your heart. She never left. She just learned how to wear a crown made of silence and shadows, and in this telling she comes back. Let's speak softly tonight, not because we fear waking anyone, but because some stories are sacred and deserve to be told like lullabies. We'll walk slowly, step by step, through your life. Not just the battles and betrayals, but the meals you shared, the children you held, the dreams you whispered into, the trees. Every night another piece. Every night a little closer to remembering what it meant to be you. We'll travel across misty fields, down winding trails carved by deer, into the hush of ancient temples that never made it into the records. You'll hear voices again. Not the kind that shouted your name in anger or praise, but the quiet ones. The ones that said, "You are enough. You are fire. You are the storm they feared, long before you lifted a blade." But tonight, we don't lift anything. No weapons, no burdens, just memories. You've earned the right to rest. Let the world fade away. Let the glow of the fire warm your toes. The story is only just beginning. And tonight, we start not with the warrior, but with the girl who once told the wind her secrets and heard it laugh. Sleep easy, Twilight Queen. You are home again. Close your eyes now. The moon is still overhead, but it's a different time. The stars have spun backwards, and the earth beneath your feet feels younger, wilder, softer, like it hasn't yet learned to flinch from boots or wheels. You are a child again. Not in the way dreams make us children, confused and floating, but properly, joyfully, tangibly small. Your legs are scratched from brambles. Your hair is full of burrs and secrets. And your heart, oh, your heart is full of the kind of wild curiosity only children and foxes truly understand. The land of the Iceni is not yet conquered. It stretches wide and open, from the gray-green hills where mist clings like a shawl, down to riverbanks where reeds whisper riddles in the wind. You know every inch of this place. It is your playground, your home, your kingdom. Even if the Ait crown is only a wreath of heather woven in secret, you were a curious child. Too curious, perhaps. You once tried to climb the giant standing stone at the edge of the village because someone said the sky looked different from the top. You got halfway up, slipped, and landed in a puddle of sheep dung. You weren't upset. You just sniffed yourself, announced, "Smells like the gods," had lunch, and went on your way. The elders watched you with a mix of concern and reluctant affection. "She's clever," one said. "She's trouble," another muttered. Both. Your mother sighed and wiped your muddy face with the edge of her sleeve. She was a strong woman, your mother. All elbows and laughter and sharp opinions. She taught you to listen for the wind's direction before lighting a fire, and how to spot a liar by the way they blink too often. "Most useful skill for a queen," she'd say. Then ruffle your hair and steal your honey cake. Your father, quieter, carved things out of wood, bowls, spoons, the occasional bird that didn't really resemble a bird but made you smile anyway. He told stories in the evenings, soft, slow ones, about giants who lived in the hills and owls who kept secrets for the gods. You believed every word. You still do, somewhere deep down. Your village was small, but it pulsed with life. Chickens ran freely. Dogs barked at shadows. Children played war with sticks and got told off for accidentally hitting someone's goat. You were always at the center of it, a blur of red hair, bare feet, and half-finished ideas. One spring, you tried to build a flying cart out of woven reeds and feathers. It didn't fly. It fell, gloriously, into a patch of thistles. You limped for a week but declared the experiment mostly successful. Another time, you tried to train a squirrel to deliver messages. It bit you. Twice. You still have the scar, a tiny crescent on your thumb, a reminder that not all things wild can be tamed even by you. And then there was the druid. A man of smoke and moss. He lived just beyond the edge of the village, where the trees grew closer together in time. Felt slow. You weren't supposed to go there alone, but of course you did. Repeatedly. He didn't mind, not really. He called you Little Branch, and let you sit by the fire as he crushed herbs and muttered things under his breath. He told you which plants could heal, which could hurt, and which could make someone confess their secrets if steeped in hot wine. You tried that one on your sister. She didn't confess anything, but she did throw up on your shoes. Lesson learned. The druid said, your spirit was old. Not in a dusty way, he clarified. In a storm-watching sort of way. You'll see things before they come. You weren't sure what that meant, but you liked the sound of it. You spent hours lying in the heather fields, staring at clouds and wondering what it would feel like to be taller than the trees. Not just physically, but in presence, in voice. You didn't want power. Not then. You wanted to matter. To be heard. to make things better for the ones who didn't have loud voices or brave hearts. You didn't know then that you were already becoming the kind of person empires fear. One summer, the Romans came to trade, not conquer. Not yet, just trade. They brought shiny coins, polished manners, and strange smells. You were fascinated. You followed one soldier around the village until he turned and offered you a coin with a bored look. You bit it. It tasted of nothing. You gave it back and said, "Your currency is flavorless." He didn't laugh, but your father did. And later he carved you a wooden coin and painted it gold. You carried it in your pouch for years. The Romans left, but the scent of them lingered. Something had shifted. You felt it in the soil, in the sky. The land held its breath, and so did you. But for now, in this chapter, you are still a child, still dancing around fires, still whispering to trees and hoping they whisper back. The world has not yet asked you to fight. You are still allowed to dream. So dream now. Let the heather cradle you. Let the memory of a simpler time wrap itself around your bones. There is courage, coming. There is heartbreak. There is fire, but not yet. Tonight you are just Boudica, the girl with a feather in her hair and dirt under her nails, pretending her wooden coin buys wishes. And who knows? Maybe it did. The wind has changed. It still rustles through the heather, still hums in the trees. But now there's something else threaded into its voice. A new note. Faint, metallic. As if someone had dropped a silver coin into the soil, and the ground has started remembering. You are older now. Not grown, but growing. The edges of childhood still cling to you like burrs on your cloak, but you're starting to see the world with eyes that no longer blink at every marvel. You still dream. Still chase foxes, but there's a quiet weight beneath it all. The land feels different. Not wrong. Not yet. But watched. And that's when they came back. The Romans. They didn't storm your village or light torches in the night. No. They came like guests, like merchants, like people who smile a little too much when they're measuring the size of your house. They arrived in carts with big wheels and boots that made too much noise on soft ground. Their armor caught the sun like broken glass. Their voices carried, clipped, crisp, full of strange rhythm and hard R's. To your people, the Iceni, it was a curiosity. To you, it was almost funny. You remember the first time you saw one of their centurions trying to ride a pony borrowed from the next village over. The poor animal was built for hills and baskets of barley, not armor-plated invaders. It took 3 steps, wobbled, and promptly sat down. The Roman, very dignified, slowly slid off and muttered something that sounded like "cursed cabbage." You laughed, loudly. He did not. They didn't understand your language at first, and you didn't understand theirs. So your people spoke with hands and smiles and the occasional wild gesture involving fish. Trades were made, coins exchanged. The Romans brought wine that tasted like spoiled apples, and you offered them mead so strong it made one of them cry. For a while, it almost felt like peace. Almost, because under their pleasantries and polished manners, there was pressure. Their eyes wandered, measured, judged. They looked at your wooden houses and fur-lined cloaks and seemed to think, quaint. You could see it in their faces, the quiet superiority. The way they handled things that weren't theirs like they might someday be. They were always taking notes, in their heads, on scraps of parchment, about your land, your customs, your leaders. You heard one of them ask if your people believed in property. You replied, "We believe in not having neighbors, like you." Again, no laughter. You noticed other things too, the way they spoke about their own gods. So rigid, so proper. Jove this, Mars that. Their gods were soldiers and judges. Yours were rivers and birds and the whisper in the yew tree when no one else was near. You wondered if their gods had ever danced, or cried, or laughed at their own reflection in a pond. The contrast between you grew clearer. They built roads, straight as lies, right through places your people had considered sacred for generations. When you asked one Roman why, he said, efficiency. You said, and where does it go? He said, to Rome. You said, then I'll walk the long way. There were tensions, small ones at first. A market stall overturned, a complaint about a missing sheep. A drunken soldier trying to buy a wife with copper coins and getting chased out of the village by a grandmother with a broom. But it grew, because while your people laughed things off and chalked it up to cultural confusion, the Romans weren't confused. They were calculating, testing, mapping, slowly moving from guests to something else. One evening, you sat with your mother near the fire. The light flickered over her lined face as she sharpened a bone needle. They're clever, she said. You nodded. But clever people forget things, she added. Like how land has memory. How water remembers who steps in it with dirty boots. You didn't understand then, not fully. But you remembered it. Because the land did feel restless. The birds flew differently. The wolves howled less. And the trees, they no longer whispered quite the same way. Even your old friend the druid had grown quieter. When you visited him one foggy morning, he gave you a sprig of mistletoe and said, keep this close. It'll remind the spirits you're one of us when the world starts forgetting. You asked what he meant. He just looked at the horizon, where a Roman signal fire flickered faintly through the haze. The Empire doesn't ask permission, he murmured. It just arrives, and keeps arriving. But you still believed things would stay mostly the same. You still ran through the grass with your cousins, still made jokes about Roman sandals, which, let's be honest, looked like someone had lost a fight with a leather snake. You still held the wooden coin your father made, still dreamed of love, and peace and finding out if owls really could see the future. It wasn't yet time for swords, but the whisper was growing louder. And part of you, the part that had always been storm watching, began to listen. Because you could feel it, couldn't you? The tremble in the soil, the hush before the downpour. Something was coming. You didn't know what yet. But the land always knew. Love didn't come to you like lightning. It came like embers, soft, glowing, slow to catch. But once lit, it never truly went out. You were not yet a queen when you met Prasutagus. Not even close. You were a young woman who still tied feathers in her braids, still carried a slingshot in her pouch, just in case, and still half believed that love was something for bards to sing about, not something that happened by a smoky fire in a roundhouse too small for ceremony. He was quiet. At first, that was the first thing you noticed. In a world of warriors and shouting traders and boisterous festivals, he stood still, watched, listened. Not because he was shy. No, there was nothing timid about him, but because he understood the power of silence. You met him during the spring festival, the kind where people drank too much, sang off key, and tried to jump over fire without setting their trousers alight. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. That impressed you. While others were wrestling for fun and spilling mead into the grass, he was sitting near the edge of the firelight, feeding a small dog bits of roasted meat and smiling like someone who already had all he needed. You sat down, beside him uninvited, holding a cup of honey wine and a loaf of sweetbread you didn't want to share but did anyway. You don't wrestle? You asked. I do, he said, taking a bite. But I don't need to tonight. Why not? He looked at you then. Not glanced. Looked. Like he was reading something written between your freckles. Because I've already found what I was looking for. You nearly choked on your wine. Then you laughed. Loudly. He didn't. He just smiled that small, confident, maddening smile, and for the first time in a very long time you weren't sure if someone was teasing you or telling the truth. He was older than you by a few seasons. Not too many. Just enough to carry himself with a kind of settled strength, like a tree that knew where it wanted to grow. He'd traveled more than most in your village, seen Roman towns, spoken with traders, learned how to read some of their strange, curling letters, though he found them cold and humorless. He liked old stories. Better you talked for hours that night. about politics and rivers and how foxes were smarter than most kings. He didn't flinch when you argued. He didn't interrupt. He listened. And when you caught him watching you the next morning while you wrestled your cousin in the mud, he didn't look away. He grinned. And you blushed for the first time in years. It wasn't a whirlwind. It was a slow burn. You grew to love him like one grows to love the sound of rain, without realizing when it began, only knowing you'd miss it deeply if it stopped. Proposed by accident. You were walking through a grove of ash trees, arguing over whether the stars moved or the earth did. He insisted on the stars. You called him an optimistic goat, and he said, almost absent-mindedly, "You're the only person I'd ever want to raise daughters with." You stopped, turned. "Is that a proposal?" you asked. He blinked. "I suppose it is." "Well," you said, arms crossed, "next time try flowers." But you kissed him anyway. The wedding wasn't grand. It was warm, full of laughter and toasted, barley cakes and slightly inappropriate songs sung by elderly uncles. You wore a dress dyed with crushed berries and fern leaves. He wore his usual tunic and a slightly panicked expression which softened the moment your fingers found his. That night you didn't feel like a queen. You felt like yourself. Home. Human. The days that followed were simple and sacred. You rose early, walked the fields, shared bread and stories, argued over the best way to cure fish. He let you win, most of the time. You took in stray dogs, planted herbs outside the house, talked about the children you might one day raise. Strong girls, with loud voices and sharper wit. He called you his flame. You called him your calm. He ruled your tribe, yes, but not like a conqueror. He ruled like a man holding a sleeping bird, careful, thoughtful, afraid to squeeze too hard. He kept the peace with the Romans as best he could, negotiated, deferred, conceded small things in exchange for larger freedoms. It wasn't perfect, but it worked. For a while, you watched him in those moments, standing tall, choosing diplomacy over pride, holding back the storm, and you loved him more for it, because he believed in peace, and so did you. Back then, at night, the two of you would lie beneath the stars and dream out loud, not just for yourselves but for your people, a land where traditions could breathe, where daughters could inherit, where the sacred groves weren't carved into roads, where your tribe didn't have to shrink or bow or fade. You believed you could build that. Together. The fire in your belly hadn't dimmed. It had simply changed direction, burned not to destroy, but to warm, to nurture. You were strong, yes, but you were also tender, and for a time that was enough. You weren't Boudica the rebel or the war cry. You were Boudica, wife, partner, dreamer, queen by hearthlight. But the hearth, like all things, could not keep out the storm forever, and far to the south the Roman wheels were already turning. Not all crowns are made of gold. Some are woven from the sound of a child's laughter, from small hands gripping yours in trust, from lullabies hummed under a moss-covered roof, while outside the wind forgets how to howl. You wore such a crown. They say Boudica was fierce, unstoppable, a flame wrapped in bronze. But you remember the softness first, the quiet moments, the lull before the legend. You remember your daughters, 2 of them, born beneath different moons, but both with hair like wildfire and wills to match. The eldest had your eyes, clever, unblinking, always watching. The youngest had your husband's quiet smile, and a laugh like sunlight filtering through leaves. They were not just girls, they were galaxies, each with their own orbits and storms. And from the first moment you held them, slick and squirming, and impossibly real, your world recentered. History could wait. Empires could stall. This tiny weight on your chest, this breath-soft miracle, was everything. You called them daughters of the dawn because they changed the way you saw the morning. No longer a time for rising and tending to duties, but a time to see what games they would invent, what questions they would ask, What butterflies they would chase with such furious purpose, you'd think they were on some grand sacred mission. And perhaps they were. You raised them not as ornaments or heirs, but as people. They climbed trees, scraped knees, stole honey when they thought no one was watching. They asked impossible questions at inappropriate times, like whether gods sleep, or how big the world really is, or why Romans smelled like wet stone. You didn't raise them to be quiet. You raised them to be kind, to think, to challenge. When the youngest once tried to challenge a visiting Roman official to a stick duel because he said women shouldn't speak in council, you pretended to scold her. But later that night, you slipped her a second honey cake and whispered, "Next time, aim lower, right below the knee." She grinned, teeth sticky with sugar, and said, "Yes, Mama." They called you Mama, not Queen. Even the guards, the elders, the traders who came to court, they saw you first as a mother. Hair hastily braided, tunic stained with berry juice from little fingers that had been fed too early. A queen with a basket of laundry in one hand and a child on the other hip. But that was your strength. Your people trusted you more because they saw how you held your children, how you listened to them, how you didn't rule from a distant tower but from beside the hearth where bedtime stories were told with the same gravity as political decisions. Prasutagus loved them fiercely. He carved little figurines for them, wolves and bears, and once, inexplicably, a three-legged goat. The girls painted them with crushed flowers and used them in elaborate battles that often ended with everyone attending a pretend tea ceremony under the table. At night, after the girls had fallen asleep in a pile of limbs and dreams, you and he would sit by the fire, talk about their futures, wonder who they'd become. You hoped one would be a healer. He hoped one would be a poet. They hoped, most of all, that both would live in peace. You tried to give them that. There were lessons, of course. You taught them about plants, about the stars, about justice, about how to braid hair without snarls and how to identify which mushrooms were edible and which would make you talk to rocks. Sometimes you think they deliberately mixed the two just for fun. You taught them to fight, yes, but not with anger, with grace, with purpose, with the understanding that violence is a last resort, not a first instinct, that words can shield just as well as swords, sometimes better. They listened, absorbed, grew like trees, bent by wind, kissed by sun, rooted deep in the soil of your love. But there were shadows too. They started small, a Roman caravan passing too close, a tax collector who stayed too long, a tension in your husband's shoulders that no amount of herbal tea could ease. You noticed. So did the girls. The oldest began asking sharper questions. The youngest stayed closer to you at night. They sensed something. Even before the maps changed. Even before Rome stopped knocking and started pushing. But you did not let fear into the hearth, not then. Instead, you held them tighter, sang louder, told them stories of gods who transformed into deer to escape hunters, of clever foxes who outwitted giants, of a queen who once tricked an invading army into chasing their own shadows. The girls giggled, asked for more, and you gave them everything, because in your heart you knew the world was shifting, and their childhood, this luminous, precious thing, was a flame in the wind. You would protect it. You would protect them, not just as a mother, but as a queen. But for now, for this moment in the story, they are still yours. Still safe, still curled beside you in sleep, breathing dreams of fields and rivers and magic bones that grant wishes if held under moonlight. And you are still Boudica, still fire but banked, still thunder waiting, still mother, queen, woman, all at once. And the daughters of the dawn are dreaming beside you. While the empire sharpens its knives, there is a kind of silence that isn't quiet. You know the one. It comes just before the rain, when the air tastes like iron and the birds fall still. The clouds gather, thick and bruised, and the wind doesn't howl. It holds its breath. That was your kingdom not yet burning, not yet broken. But waiting. The Iceni land still looked the same. To a careless eye, nothing had changed. The fields were green. The rivers sang. Children ran barefoot through the grass, their laughter skipping, like stones over the hills. But underneath, beneath the surface, the soil had shifted, and you felt it, in the way the traders hesitated before mentioning Rome, in the new Roman official who smiled too much and blinked too little, in the fresh agreements that came written in Latin no one asked you to understand, but everyone expected you to obey. Still, the people hoped, because you and Prasutagus had kept them safe. Year after year, you balanced the knife's edge between cooperation and resistance. You knew when to bow your head, just enough to look humble, never enough to look weak. He was good at that. Your husband understood diplomacy. He'd walk with the Roman governors and pour them mead while speaking of crops, roads, taxes. He would smile, nod, offer gifts, and extract just enough from the exchange to make it seem like his idea. A master of the long game. And you? You stood behind him, not hidden, just measured, letting them underestimate you, letting them forget the steel beneath your silence. It was an uneasy peace, but it held, like an old bridge, creaking with every gust but standing still. There were days when you believed it might last. You took comfort in small things. A market day with no arguments, a Roman patrol that passed without incident, the way the light danced through the trees in the early morning when you walked with your daughters and tried to name every bird by its song. Hope hung in the air like mist, thin but present. Your people still came to you for guidance, not because they feared you, but because they trusted you. They saw the way you listened, the way you asked questions instead of giving orders, the way your hand stayed near the sword, but never reached for it without reason. You didn't rule through fear. You ruled through steadiness, and the land responded. The crops were good that year. The winters had grown kinder. Even the foxes seemed fatter. But peace, you knew, is not a destination. It's a pause. And lately, the pause was stretching. You heard rumors, whispers. Farther south, other tribes had been forced to surrender land. A queen had been taken hostage by Roman authorities for her protection. An elder had vanished after refusing to kneel. The empire was growing restless. It no longer wanted your cooperation. It wanted your obedience. And yet, Prasutagus held firm. He believed in diplomacy, even as it frayed. He wrote a will, a clever one, naming the Roman emperor as co-heir alongside your daughters. An offering, a shield, a way perhaps to buy just a little more peace. You let him. You knew why he did it. You held his hand after he signed it, and neither of you spoke of the fear crawling beneath the ink. That was the last true peace you knew, because the storm was already on its way. You saw it in the eyes of your guards, in the way the Roman patrols grew more frequent, in the new fort built a little too close to your village, in the official decree that forbade certain rituals, the old dances, the sacred wells, the solstice fires. They said it was for safety. You knew better. And your daughters, they felt it too. The oldest stopped laughing as easily, began sharpening her stick sword without being asked. The youngest asked you quietly one night if the Romans would still like her when she grew up. You held her tighter than usual. The druids warned you. The gods grew silent. Even the animals, the crows, the deer, moved differently, as if choosing other paths. And the dreams. Oh, the dreams. You started waking in the middle of the night, sweating, heart racing, dreams of burning fields, of silver helmets glinting under a dark sky, of screams caught in the wind like broken music. But you never told anyone. Not yet. Instead, you smiled, wove new clothes for the winter, oversaw grain storage, attended council meetings with a calm face, played with your daughters by the river, prayed, quietly, fiercely, to gods who no longer answered quickly, because hope is stubborn, and mothers are even more so. There was still a kingdom to hold, Still people who believed in you. Still the memory of peace, delicate and fading, like the last leaf before frost. So you carried on, walked your fields, counted your blessings, watched the horizon and waited for the wind to change. The fire was low that night. Not out, just tired. The kind of fire that doesn't dance anymore, only glows, like a heartbeat fading beneath thick wool. You sat beside it, legs tucked under your cloak, your fingers wrapped around a cup you hadn't touched. Across from you, Prasutaga slept fitfully, his breath shallow, caught between sigh and silence. You had known this was coming, not in a dramatic thunder and lightning kind of way. No prophecy, no foreboding drumbeat. Just the slow, steady unraveling of a man who had given more of himself than the world could return. He had ruled gently, argued wisely, bartered peace with men who respected neither peace nor women. He had smiled through their arrogance, bitten his tongue when lesser men insulted the land he loved, and now he was dying. You had seen death before, many times. But this was different. This was not death as a blow, sudden and sharp. This was death like snow, soft, quiet, inevitable. The druid said it was his heart, worn thin, not broken, a thread used too often to mend what wasn't his to fix. You asked them for cures anyway. Herbs, smoke, stones blessed under moonlight. They offered them all, but none with hope. So, you sat with him, every night, watching the rise and fall of his chest, listening for the change, the shift from breath to stillness. He had no last words, not like in the stories. No grand declarations, no whispered prophecy. Just a squeeze of your hand one evening, and a faint smile, the kind he gave you when he'd caught you hiding food under the table for the dogs. The kind that said, "I trust you." That night, he slipped away. No gasp, no rattle, just a breath that didn't return, and the fire, which had burned all evening, finally sank into embers. You didn't cry. Not at first. There were things to do, ceremonies to prepare, messengers to send, mourning clothes to unpack from cedar-lined chests. You moved through it all like someone watching from outside their own body. Calm, measured, queenly. The daughters cried. The youngest wailed like a storm against the sea. The oldest didn't cry at all. Just sat beside his body, one hand on his cooling chest, her face carved from stone. You tried to speak, but your voice broke. So instead, you held them, both of them. Your arms around their shaking shoulders, your own grief hidden between heartbeats. The wake was long. Your people came in silence, bringing offerings, bread, salt, carved tokens, small bottles of mead. They lit candles, told stories, sang the songs he liked, the ones about clever wolves and old kings who married the moon. Someone played a flute, off-key, but with love. You stayed beside him, draped in furs, wreathed in herbs, your face painted with ash and ochre. You sat as queen and widow both, a monument and a mother. The Roman governor came, late, with 2 guards and an expression that tried to look solemn but couldn't quite hide its calculation. He offered words, empty, polished, practiced. Said your husband was a valued client king, and that his loyalty would be remembered. You said nothing. He offered to review the will in private. You still said nothing, because you knew. You knew. Prasutagus had written his will carefully, naming the Roman emperor as co-heir, yes, a political shield, but also naming your daughters, his blood, his lineage, his hope. But Rome does not honor the wills of dying kings if it weakens their hold. They honored coin, roads, obedience, and they saw now, and with the king gone and a queen and daughters in his place, gone to an opportunity, a gap, a chance. You watched them leave, the governor, the guards, the silence they left behind louder than their words. That night you wept, not just for him, but for everything he had tried to protect. Everything you had built together, the peace you had believed in, the daughters he had hoped would rule, not with swords but with stories. You wept in the dark, quietly, so they wouldn't hear, and when the dawn came, gray and sharp-edged, you rose, braided your hair, donned your cloak, and stepped outside, not as a grieving wife, but as a queen without a shield. The fire was low that morning, but it had not gone out. Not yet. You had prepared yourself for grief. You had worn black wool, woven with ash and sage. You had sung the old songs with the elders, your voice steady even as your daughters wept into your sleeves. You had poured wine on your husband's grave, slow and silent, murmuring the names of his fathers and his fathers' fathers before him. You had accepted the ache in your chest, the hollowness at your side, the quiet where once his breath had been. But you had not prepared for this. The letter arrived at dawn, not with ceremony, not with respect, just a scroll, carried by a thin Roman messenger who would not meet your eyes. He handed it to you as one might pass along a bucket of spoiled milk. His sandals were still wet from dew. You opened it with steady hands. Read it once, then twice, because the words seemed impossible. It was written in cold Latin. No greeting, no honorifics, no acknowledgement of the dead king's passing beyond a line that began, in accordance with imperial administration. Prasutagis's will had been rejected. His request that his daughters inherit jointly with the emperor, denied. His property, absorbed. His kingdom, dissolved into a Roman province. The Iceni, once allies of Rome, now subjects without negotiation. No explanation, no discussion, just a fact. The letter ended with a list of expected tithes and a date. You stared at it for a long while, not feeling the parchment in your hands, not hearing the breeze lifting the edge of the scroll. Somewhere far away a rooster crowed. A child laughed. The village stirred into another ordinary morning. But nothing about this morning was ordinary. You called for your council. They came in haste, half-dressed, hair still wet, thinking it was a matter of security or perhaps another Roman tax. You laid the scroll on the table. Let them read. No one spoke for a very long time. When they did, it was in low voices, disbelief, outrage, confusion. One old man thumped the scroll with the end of his cane, muttering that even wolves gave warning before they bit. Another asked if perhaps it was a mistake, a poor translation. But you knew better. You remembered the governor's cold eyes at the wake, the way he lingered near the door, the way he had looked at your daughters not as mourners, but as obstacles. It had not been a mistake. It had been a plan. That afternoon, the Roman enforcers arrived. Not soldiers, not yet, but worse. Bureaucrats in armor carrying tablets and wax seals. Men who smelled of oil and ink, who used words like seizure, violation, and reallocation with the same ease others used, please and thank you. They entered your longhouse uninvited. You stood at the threshold. This is not your land, you said. The one in front, young, too young with soft skin and a cruel smile, held up the scroll as if it were a sword. It is now, he said. You blocked his path. He struck you, just once, the back of his hand across your face. Not hard enough to knock you down, but hard enough to echo. Your people saw, your daughter saw, they did not stop there. They pushed past you, tore down tapestries, seized what they could carry. Carved bowls, woven cloth, ceremonial weapons. The heirlooms of generations reduced to inventory. They spoke to each other in Latin, laughing, pointing, mocking. One of them held up your daughter's carved necklace and said, "Roman children don't wear such trash." And then, they took them. Not for ransom. Not for trial. They dragged your daughters into the street. The daughters of a queen, the granddaughters of kings. They humiliated them. You screamed, fought, but hands gripped you from all sides. You remember the taste of blood, your own. And the sound, not your daughter's cries, but the silence of your people, frozen in horror. When it was done, they left without a word. No punishment. No apology. No hesitation. Just dust. And silence. You stood in the wreckage, shaking. The necklace was broken on the floor. The chair your husband once carved had been split. Its legs snapped for kindling. One of your daughter's dolls, the one stuffed with straw and stitched with a crooked grin, lay face down in the dirt. You picked it up. Your fingers trembled, and still, no tears came. Not yet. That night, you walked to the sacred grove. The moon was thin, the trees tall and watching. You brought no offerings, only your pain. You knelt in the moss, pressed your palms to the ground, whispered your husband's name, your daughter's names, and your own name. Not Boudica the wife, or the mother, or the queen, just Boudica, woman wounded, waiting. The grove did not speak, but the wind shifted. You looked up. Somewhere in the dark, an owl hooted, low, warning. You had always loved owls. You stood, slowly, deliberately, and for the first time, you allowed yourself the thought, if Rome has forgotten who I am, then I will remind them, not with petitions, not with scrolls, but with something older, older than empire, older than kings, with fire, with iron, with memory, because they thought they had broken you, but they had only broken the seal, and what came next would not be written in ink. It began with silence, not the kind of silence that soothes like the hush of a sleeping forest, but the silence of breath held too long, of people waiting for someone, anyone, to move first. That someone was you. You didn't call it a revolt. Not yet. You called it remembering. Remembering who you were, who your people were, what had been taken, and what must never be taken again. The morning after they broke your daughters, your door remained shut. You didn't speak. You didn't eat. But your presence was felt all the same. The village was quieter than usual. Fires were lit with shaking hands. Mothers held their children closer. No bird song broke the dawn. The world seemed to know. Something had shifted, and then you emerged, cloaked in black, hair braided high, no jewelry, no finery. Just a single iron torque around your neck, once your husband's, now worn like a vow. You stood at the village circle, raised your arm, and said 3 words. They have forgotten. That was all. No speech, no fury. But the words carried, from house to house, from ear to ear. They echoed not in volume but in weight. And when the blacksmith stepped forward and laid his hammer at your feet, the silence cracked. He was the first, then a shepherd, then 2 weavers, then a woman too old to walk far, but who came anyway, leaning on a staff carved with runes older than Rome. One by one, they stood with you. They brought nothing fancy, no swords, no banners, only their grief, their fury, their memories. You raised your eyes to the horizon, the direction of the Roman settlement, and whispered, then let them remember. And so it began, not with war cries, but with footsteps. You walked from village to village, not as a conqueror, not as a queen, but as a witness. You told the story, not of your husband's death, but of what followed. You told of the will torn in, ink of the laughter of Roman soldiers while your daughters screamed, of the scrolls and the bruises and the gods who no longer answered prayers said in Latin. You did not ask for swords. You simply asked, do you still remember who you are? And they did. Oh, they did. The Trinovantes joined first, another tribe long held in quiet contempt by Roman governors. Then the Catuvellani, whose sacred groves had been paved over for roads. Even some of the Romanized Britons, those who wore togas and dined on imported olives, looked away from their wine and whispered, maybe she's right. The embers were catching. Your people had never forgotten what the land felt like before Rome. They remembered festivals beneath open stars, not marble ceilings. They remembered songs sung in groves, not shouted in stone forums. They remembered freedom, not perfect, not easy, but theirs. And now, with you leading, they began to wonder, what if it could be theirs again? You didn't build an army. You called a memory, a reckoning, a return. The druids, and once cautious, hidden in forest and fog, came forward again. Not with curses, but with blessings. They tied oak leaves to your wrists, whispered old words into your ears, words you hadn't heard since you were a child. The land remembers. The land remembered, and so did the people. You trained in secret. Your blacksmiths reforged farming tools into spears. The hunters shared their traps. The elders offered maps, not drawn on parchment, but in stories told in circles around the fire. There's a hidden path behind the old hill. The Romans don't guard the western fort at night. My cousin works at the outpost. He's still one of us. This was not yet war, but it was no longer peace, and you were no longer only a mother grieving her daughters. You were becoming something else, a fire wrapped in breath, a storm that walked on two legs. Still calm, still slow, but unstoppable. One night, before your first strike, you sat alone beneath a yew tree. You laid your hand on the soil and said, not to any god, but to the land itself, I will not burn what I do not love. And the ground seemed to exhale. You lit no torches that night. The stars were light enough, and with quiet feet and hearts full of ash and iron, you began to march. They built Camulodunum to last forever, stone upon stone, column beside column. A Roman city in the heart of Britannia, with temples, theaters, baths, and statues of emperors who had never tasted your wind or walked your woods. It was their promise. We are here to stay. But they forgot something. They forgot the ground they built on still belonged to someone else. You stood at the edge of a rise, looking down at it. It gleamed in the morning light. White walls, red tiles, neat rows like a game board. To the Romans it was pride. To you it was a scar. Beneath its cobbled streets old bones lay, sacred lands leveled, tribal shrines buried, stories silenced. And still they had built. They had carved their dominance into the very land. The temple at the city's heart, the temple to Claudius, was a monument to their conquest, a towering insult financed by your people's taxes, decorated with the spoils of your ancestors. They called it civilization, you called it a warning. Camulodunum had once been the capital of your people. The Romans had taken it, paved it, renamed it. They had made it their own, but not by right, by presumption. And so, on a night when the wind carried no bird song and the moon hung low like a watcher, you walked with your people toward the gates. There were no horns, no chants, no war drums, just the steady rhythm of feet on earth. The plan was simple: surround the city, cut off escape, burn from within. It was not revenge. It was a reckoning. You entered first, cloaked and unnoticed in the pre-dawn shadows. The guards were few. The governor had been warned of unrest, but he had laughed. A woman cannot lead a war, he had said, safe in his marble home. He would not live to say it again. Your signal was a hawk's cry. It rang once, twice, and then the silence broke. Your warriors poured into the streets, not like soldiers, but like a storm. Swift, sure, inevitable. Camulodunum woke too late. By the time the sun cleared the horizon, the city was already bleeding. The temple, that great symbol of Roman permanence, became the first to fall. You watched it burn. Stone cracked. Gold melted. Statues of Claudius blackened and crumbled. And as the flames rose, the smoke didn't choke you. It tasted like memory. They resisted. Of course they did. Some Roman citizens tried to flee to the shore, hoping for ships that never came. Others barricaded themselves in their homes, only to find that wood and stone alike remember how to burn. You did not laugh. You did not cheer. You walked slowly through the streets, past stunned faces, past cries and pleading and rage. You saw fear, yes, but also something else. A dawning realization in their eyes. They had thought you forgotten. They had thought you broken. They had thought wrong. Your people did not loot blindly. You gave strict commands. Take only what was stolen first. Burn what cannot be reclaimed. Leave no shrine standing that silences our own. And they obeyed. Because this was not madness. This was mourning, made visible. By midday, Camelodunum was no longer a city. It was a lesson. Its smoke curled high into the sky, a column of ash that could be seen for miles. Travelers turned back. Merchants dropped their goods. Roman scouts galloped south, choking on soot and disbelief. No one had expected you to rise, and certainly not like this. But you hadn't come to surprise them. You had come to remind them. You returned to your camp at dusk, silent, soot in your hair, ash in your throat. You sat by the fire, wrapped in a rough cloak, and your daughters, older now, hardened too soon, sat beside you. They did not speak. They had seen what the Empire did to innocence. They did not need explanations. You shared bread that night. Simple food, warm from the coals. Someone began to sing. A low, old song, barely a melody. Others joined. You let your head rest back, looked up at the smoke-streaked stars. You did not smile, but you were at peace, because you knew this was only the beginning. After Camelodunum, the world held its breath. You could feel it in the trees. The leaves didn't rustle as freely. The birds flew higher. The ground, still warm from ash and blood, seemed to pulse beneath your feet like a heartbeat growing louder. And, beyond the smoke, Londinium waited. It was not the oldest of Roman towns, but it had become one of the most important. A center of trade, a hub of roads and boats and coins and rules. It sprawled along the river like a net cast wide, buildings of stone and timber, walls still young, streets lined with people who called themselves civilized. You didn't hate it, but you didn't fear it either. You saw it for what it was. A tether, a root the Romans had sunk deep into your land. They called it progress, but you saw it like ivy crawling over an old tree, beautiful perhaps, but hungry. After Camelodunum, word spread quickly. You didn't send messengers. You didn't need to. The roads themselves spoke for you. The smoke that rose from the ruins of the temple to Claudius was seen from fields far and wide. The sound of your people's voices rising together like wind through pine was louder than any trumpet. They called you Queen of the Reckoning. Some whispered your name in fear, others in awe. But you didn't want to be feared. You wanted to be heard. Londinium was not your next stop by accident. It was chosen. Because of what it represented. Because it had flourished while others had faded. Because the governors who sat there had nodded solemnly as they signed the papers that declared your family's legacy void. Because the ships docked there, heavy with goods plundered from your lands, sailed back to Rome and returned with more. Flaws because they thought it untouchable, and you wanted them to remember. Nothing is. The march was slow by design. Your army had grown, no longer just warriors, but whole communities. Old men who remembered how to hold a spear, women who'd buried sons for peace, children walking beside their elders, learning old. Songs turned into war hymns sung softly like prayers. You stopped in villages along the way, not to recruit, not to threaten, just to speak. You stood in their circles beside their fires and told them what had happened, what the Romans had done, what your daughters had endured, what the temple had become. You didn't beg. You simply offered them a choice, and each time more joined. Not all could fight, but all could stand, could watch, could remember. The roads themselves carried your movement forward. Ironically, they had made it easier. Roman roads, built for speed and order, now turned against their makers. They had made straight lines to every place they hoped to own. You followed those lines, and behind you came whispers. Boudica is coming. Camelodunum burns. Even the gods have turned. The governor of Londinium, Suetonius Paulinus, had not waited. Word reached him in the north. He was still campaigning, trying to crush the Druids on the island of Mona. But when he heard what you had done, he turned south fast. Too fast. By the time he reached Londinium, you were already close. But he did not stand to fight. He evacuated, took what soldiers he had, abandoned the city, left the people behind, merchants, settlers, artisans, Roman citizens. All told, they must fend for themselves. He made a calculation. Londinium can fall, but the province must not. You saw the city before sunrise. Fog hung low along the river. The Thames gleamed silver in the half-light, and behind its shimmer, the city slumbered. You could see outlines, rooftops, columns, gates. A place not built to withstand siege. You waited until dawn, and then you walked. Not marched. Walked. Your army followed. The gates were open. No defenders. No guards. Just a hollow city, half aware of what was coming. You entered like memory itself. You did not shout. You did not need to. People fled. Others begged. Some tried to hide, clutching their fine robes, their painted scrolls, their silver utensils. All the trappings of a life built atop someone else's loss. You made your way to the center, to the place where proclamations were made, where tributes had been demanded, where the fate of your people had once been declared by strangers who never asked your name. You raised your hand, and the fire began, not out of hatred, but out of truth. Let it be known. If peace had been possible, it would have been chosen. But they had closed that door. You burned Londinium not to erase but to mark, to draw a line, to remind them for all their roads and gods and coin that there was still a voice they could not silence. The buildings cracked, the marble blackened, the wooden beams fell inward, the city howled. But you stood quiet, and when the sun set behind the smoke, turning the sky to blood and rust, you turned from the flames and walked back to your people. You did not stay to watch it fall. You had seen enough ruins. You were walking toward something else now. Not revenge. Not even justice, but memory made real in ash and wind. If I were to write a letter, not to the world, not to Rome, not even to the future, but to someone who might understand, it would be to you, to my daughters, to the two flames I carried longer than any crown, and perhaps to myself. The night is quiet now, the kind of quiet that only comes when all the voices have grown tired of speaking. The fires in the camp burn low, not out of carelessness, but respect. Rest is sacred on the edge of a storm. Even the wind has softened. I sit here in my tent of hide and ash, and I remember the things I never wrote down. So let this be my letter, unsent, unspoken, unfinished, but true. My loves, if you are reading this in the memory of your bones, in the dreams that follow long after fires fade, then I want you to know first that I did not begin with fury. No, I began with lullabies. Before Rome took your names from our scrolls, before soldiers laughed in the ashes of our shrines, before I stood before crowds of faces lit by torchlight, I was just a mother who sang you to sleep beside a smoky hearth. I did not seek rebellion. I did not dream of war. I dreamed of you, learning to read the stars, of you planting herbs in the soft earth, of you arguing about which bird brought rain and which one brought good luck. I dreamed of you marrying kind people, dancing on feast days, carrying your children on your backs through the same meadows I once ran through barefoot. I wanted peace. But peace, it seems, wanted something else. You were there when they came. You. Remember, I don't have to write it, but still I will. Because memory is power and some truths must be written. If not for them, then for us. They said our land was theirs. They tore up your father's will and said women could not inherit. They sent officials who smiled as they catalogued our temples, measured our fields, weighed our daughters in silence, and then they did what cannot be undone. They hurt you, not as prisoners, not even as enemies, but as a message meant for me. I am your mother. I know what you do not say. You smiled, both of you, too soon after. You laughed too loud when someone brought you apples. You held your heads high, but I saw your hands, clenched, cold, trembling at night beneath your blankets. You were brave, braver than anyone will ever write in their scrolls, and I was broken. But from that brokenness, something old rose up. Not rage, something older, deeper. Memory. Memory of what it means to be a daughter of the land, a daughter of the wind, of the hawk, of the rain. That's when I remembered who I was. Not just your mother, not just his widow, but Boudica. And from that moment, I have walked not as a person, but as a reckoning, not for revenge, but to make sure you would never forget who you came from, that you would never forget what they tried to make you, silent. You sleep now, just beyond this tent, not like children, not anymore. Your backs are straight, your hands wrapped around weapons that do not belong in such young palms. You speak like leaders. You advise like queens. I am proud, but I ache too, because you should have had more time, more freedom, more laughter. And I can only give you stories now. So if I do not wake tomorrow, if my body becomes part of the land we tried to save, then let this letter, though it may never be written, be what you carry in your hearts. You were not born to be victims. You were born to lead, to speak, to challenge. You are not broken. You are sharpened. And if the world does not make room for you, then you will carve it with your bare hands and bitter songs. And if they forget your names, let them tremble anyway, because your footsteps will echo through time like thunder behind a hill. You are not daughters of Rome. You are daughters of the storm, daughters of me. I sit here with the sky above me, a thin silver dome scattered with stars that do not care who wins battles. And I wonder if the gods are watching what they think of us now. Do they regret the silence? Do they envy the courage? Or are they simply waiting, like all of us, for morning? I do not know if we will win. The Romans are clever, ruthless, trained, but they are not right. And that may be enough. We have memory, we have fire, and we have each other. And that, I think, is how legends are born. Not from conquest, but from refusal. So, sleep well, my daughters. Sleep like you are still held in arms that never falter. Sleep knowing you are loved by someone who would tear down empires just to keep your names safe. And when you rise, walk softly, but never small. For your footsteps carry more than a mother's hopes. They carry all the memory Rome tried to erase, all the truth we fought to keep breathing, and the quiet fire of a letter never sent, but always meant. The morning came gray, not stormy, not bright, just gray. A sky without opinion, the kind that cannot be read, cannot be trusted, a sky that makes no promises. You rose before the light fully settled, not because you wanted to, because you had, till you had dreamt of nothing, not even shadows, just silence. And when you opened your eyes, the weight of what was ahead sat beside you like a second cloak. Outside the tent, your daughters were already awake. Their armor was plain, the metal, dulled by wear and soot. No paint, no feathers, just function. They didn't smile when they saw you, but they didn't look away. They had inherited more than your blood. They had inherited your fire. You nodded once, and they nodded back. Not as children, as equals. Today was not a beginning. Today was the answer. You rode slowly to the front. Lines, not to inspect, but to remember. Faces turned as you passed, some hopeful, some grim, many tired. You knew most of their names, knew which ones limped from old battles, which ones sang lullabies at night, which ones had carried their dead from Londinium in silence. You looked at them all, and you said the only thing that mattered. Today, we do not ask to win. We ask to be remembered. And they raised their weapons, not with cheers, but with a long, low cry, like wolves at dusk. Ancient. Final. The Roman formation was already waiting. You saw them in the distance. Small, neat, clean, perfect rows, perfect shields, perfect order. They were fewer than you, but their confidence was louder than any horn. They had chosen the field well, a narrow bottleneck, flanked by forest, with their backs to a ridge. There would be no flank, no ambush, just head-on force, against formation. They had camped here before you arrived because they knew. They wanted you to come. You had burned their cities, slain their governors, dared to speak after they told you to kneel, and now they would answer, not with politics, but with iron. Their standard fluttered above the center ranks, a red banner bearing the emblem of the eagle. It caught the wind as if it too wanted to look proud before the killing began. You stepped down from your horse, touched the earth, let the dirt fall through your fingers. This is the last soil I will hold in peace. Your army moved into position. There were more of you, thousands more. But numbers were no longer the point. Your people had come with passion, with courage, with wounds, but not with formation, not with discipline. You knew this, but you also knew what they carried inside. The Romans fought for control. You fought for memory. The signal was given, not by horn, but by the raising of your standard. A simple spear bound with heather and cloth, woven by your daughters the night before. And then the charge began. They ran like storm water down a hill. They screamed, sang, cried names of the dead. They hurled spears, swung axes, threw stones. It was chaos. Beautiful, terrifying, raw. But the Roman wall did not break. Shield to shield, their front line held. The spears behind struck with practiced timing. Every step your warriors took forward was met with a rhythm of death. And yet, they kept going. They fought like people with no home to return to. They fought like parents, like orphans, like lovers, like ghosts. They fought like a people who remembered. You joined the fight late, not from hesitation but from choice. You wanted them to see you first, see your face, your rage, your steadiness. You wanted them to remember that this storm had a name. When you entered the fray, it was not to turn the tide. It was to speak one final sentence. With every swing of your blade, we are still here, we are still here, we are still here. But the wall never broke, and the day, the long, grinding, bitter day, turned slowly from battle to slaughter. When the dust settled, and the crows began to circle, you were still standing. But you knew. It was over. The Romans had not just won. They had waited until every whisper of defiance was soaked in blood. They would tell the tale their way. They would write it in their books, Boudica defeated. The rebellion ended, but you knew what they could not write. You looked up from the ridge where your people had fallen. The sky was still gray, but you smiled. Not because you were at peace, because you knew. One day, someone would ask, who was she? And someone in somewhere on would answer, she was the fire they could not put out. She was the blood and the standard. She was the queen who dared to wake the land. They say she vanished. One moment she stood on the field at Watling Street, her hair tangled with smoke, her hands red with earth, her gaze fixed somewhere far beyond the Roman lines. And the next, she was gone. No body was ever shown, no grave marked, no monument raised by the victors, only silence. But in that silence, something stirred, not erasure, memory. And memory, once rooted, cannot be pulled up by force. They tell stories now, not all the same and never in the same words, but stories nonetheless, carried in the breath of old women and the murmurs of children, pressing close by firelight. The first one says she died on the field, that the Romans encircled her near sunset, that she refused to surrender, to kneel, to let them write the end of her life with chains. So she drew her blade, not against them, but against herself, and fell with dignity. They say she whispered her daughters' names as she died, not as a farewell, as a blessing. Another tale says she fled, disappeared into the mist with her daughters and a handful of riders, leaving behind only footprints that the rain refused to wash away. That she went north, to the moors. That she waits there still in caves the Romans never found, wrapped in shadows and patience. She rides at twilight, they whisper. If the wind is right and the earth remembers you, you'll see her at the edge of the ridge. But don't call her name unless you mean it. A third tale is stranger. It says she never truly lived at all, not as flesh, not as bone, but as the embodiment of a people's grief. That she was born not of womb, but of need. That the land, wounded and disrespected, conjured her from heather and blood and rage. That she was the voice the trees could not speak, the fist the rivers could not make, a storm given shape. And when her purpose was fulfilled, she returned to the soil, dissolved into roots, became the thrum beneath the ground that makes the grass rise. They say, Boudica is not gone. She is everywhere the Romans feared to sleep. The Romans, of course, wrote their version. Their scrolls claimed she poisoned herself after the defeat. That her rebellion was folly, her cause misguided. They wrote it as a cautionary tale. Beware the rage of women. Beware the cost of disobedience. But paper, for all its sharpness, cannot silence story. The name they tried to close in ink grew wings. It was carried in the songs of peasants who never saw her face, in the rhymes of children skipping stones across old Roman roads, in the prayers of mothers who tucked their daughters in at night and whispered, "May Boudica watch over you." In the centuries that followed, the land changed. Rome fell. Others came, built new cities on old bones, raised churches where temples once stood, paved over sacred wells. But underneath it all, beneath the bricks and bells and borders, her memory lingered. Some places still carry her breath. There is a field in East Anglia where nothing grows but heather. No matter how it is plowed, seeded, prayed over, locals say it's because her blood is too close to the surface. There is a tree near Colchester, gnarled, twisted, that blooms even in winter. The bark peels in the shape of a horse's mane, and the wind through its leaves sounds like war drums. There is a rock near the old Roman road that always feels warm to the touch, even in frost. They call it the Queen's Stone. No one dares sit on it. The Druids told their own tales, that Boudica did not die at all, but passed into the other world, that she sits at a great stone table with the spirits of fallen queens and wounded gods, that she waits for the land to call her again. She does not grow old there. She listens, she watches, and one day, if the world forgets too deeply, she will return, not with fire, but with memory sharp enough to cut through silence. And then there are the smaller stories, the ones without magic or smoke, the ones where she is not queen, nor ghost nor goddess, just a woman, a mother, a widow, someone who loved too fiercely to watch the world fall apart. These are the stories you hear in kitchens, on doorsteps, in old notebooks tucked behind clay jars. She carried her daughters through the flames. She spoke kindly even when her heart was breaking. She did not seek power, only respect. Which one is true? All of them, perhaps, or none, because history writes what it can measure. But legend writes what it must remember. And this much is certain. Boudica lived in a world that told her to kneel. And she stood. She stood when it cost her everything. She stood until her voice became the thunder behind a hill. She stood until little girls with bare feet and scraped knees whispered her name into the wind, not as a question but as a prayer. She stood, and the land has never forgotten. The story did not end with flames. Not truly, because among the ashes, among the scattered embers and broken blades, two figures remained. Not queens, not soldiers, just daughters. Your daughters. They had stood beside you at Watling Street, had watched you speak to the people, had listened to the silence before the first charge, had seen the line of Roman shields that would not bend, and when the smoke cleared, they did not run. They walked through the hush, through the aftermath, through fields now quiet in a way that had nothing to do with peace. They walked away. Not from you, from what was no longer left to hold. No one followed them, not right away. The Romans, having won, were too busy rebuilding walls, recounting coins, rewriting the story. The daughters of Boudica, they were forgotten in the chaos, not hunted, not hailed, just left. It was a strange kind of freedom. They left behind their names, took others, not to hide, to grow. They made their way north, toward lands not yet claimed in stone, past the charred remnants of towns they once knew, past rivers that still remembered their mother's voice. They spoke little at first. Grief needs its own silence. They stopped in a village too small to have known war, a place where children still laughed, where trees grew thick with moss, where no one asked them who they were, only whether they needed bread. And for the first time in many weeks, they slept without armor. The elder sister, once sharp-tongued and swift, became a healer. She learned the names of herbs from a woman who had never left the valley. She grew things, patched wounds, taught children how to listen for storms by watching how the swallows flew. She carried no weapon, but always walked with a staff carved with quiet symbols: oak, ash, and thorn. The younger, more quiet, more fire in her eyes, took to the hills. She followed fox trails, learned how to snare, how to read the stars, how to live in mist and shadow. She never quite trusted the world again, but she learned to love its small things, the way sunlight caught in spiderwebs, the smell of wet earth after rain, the silence just before a deer steps into view. They didn't speak of the war often, only in dreams sometimes, only when thunder rolled, only when a child, unthinking, pointed at a Roman coin and said, "Who is this?" And then they would exchange a glance. Not sad, not angry, just remembering. Years passed, people forgot. The empire marched on. But in that small valley, stories took root again. The girls who came from fire, they planted trees, told stories in gentle tones. And when other girls, scared or lost, found their way to the village, they were welcomed, given tea, a bed, a name to borrow until they found their own again. The daughters never built monuments. They built paths, soft ones through forest and across field, paths that didn't demand but invited. And sometimes, only sometimes, they would walk those paths at twilight and whisper, "We remember." They each loved, in time, not as girls desperate to heal, but as women who had already survived. The elder married a weaver who sang to goats. The younger lived alone by the ridge, but was never lonely, for she kept a pack of hounds, and the occasional fox that refused to leave. Neither had children, but they raised many. Stray ones, sad ones, fierce ones. And the children grew up knowing that strength did not always shout. Sometimes it hummed, softly, like a lullaby sung under breath. As the years grew long, they aged with grace. Lines came to their faces like roots in stone, slow, inevitable, beautiful. One of them died in spring. The other, not long after, not in war, in sleep. With hands folded over a wooden charm carved long ago by a father she barely remembered, and a braid of hair, reddish still, tucked beside her pillow, the people of the valley buried them beneath twin oaks. No names carved, just 2 circles of stones, and between the trees, a bench, where people sit now. Still, to this day, they say, if you sit there long enough and the wind is right, you'll hear humming. 2 voices. Low. One weaving herbs into garlands, the other watching the tree line, and both remembering. Because the fire ends, but the warmth remains. And the road they walked, out of ruin, through memory into healing, never truly ends. It waits for the next footsteps. They never found her grave. No slab of carved stone, no royal pyre, no urn sealed with oil and myth. And so the world was left with a question, one that no sword could answer, no scroll could resolve. Where did Boudica go? Some say she fell, where she stood at Watling Street, her blood mixing with thousands of others. That her bones lie scattered in the English clay, indistinguishable from soldier or shepherd, queen or cook. That she did not ask to be buried with glory, only with truth. Others say her daughters carried her under cloak of night, beyond the reach of Roman law and Roman pride. They took her body through the woods, past the carved stones of her ancestors, to a secret hill known only to the women of her line. They say she rests beneath an ancient oak whose leaves never fall. But there's another tale, not more true perhaps, but more lasting, that Boudica is not buried, because the land itself became her tomb, and her temple, and her voice. There is a hill that many do not notice. It is not high. It does not boast sharp ridges or echoing views. It rises gently, like the shoulder of someone sleeping beneath a blanket. The grass grows wild there, not in neat tufts, but in soft, tangled waves, touched more by mist than by sunlight. Locals call it the Quiet Rise. They do not build near it, not from fear, from instinct. Animals avoid grazing on its crest. Birds circle it without perching. Children, when they stray too close, grow quiet, not afraid, just thoughtful, like they've entered a library with invisible walls. There are no signs, no fences, no markers. But if you walk there, slowly, open-heartedly, you may feel something settle in your bones. A weight, not heavy, just ancient. Like someone is watching, not to judge, to witness. Many who visit the Rise bring offerings. They don't call them that, not aloud. But still, they leave things. A single stone painted with a spiral, a ribbon tied to a branch, a flower picked from far away, a braid of red thread. They do not ask for miracles, they ask to remember, and the land listens, not with ears, with roots. Sometimes in spring, the grass in the center parts in a perfect circle, not trampled, not cut, just opened, as if something beneath had shifted, then settled again. The old ones say that's when she turns in her sleep, not disturbed, just restless. Stories cling to the Rise like dew. A mother once brought her son, who could not speak. She sat with him for hours in silence. When they returned home, he looked at her and said, clear as rain, she sings. A wandering bard, down to his last coin and note, slept at the base of the hill and dreamed of a woman in furs who handed him a melody wrapped in wool. He wrote it down the next morning and played it in every village. People cried without knowing why. Even a Roman, long after the rebellion had faded from memory, came to the hill. A man with letters and laws, sent to measure land for a new road. He stood on the Rise, notebook in hand, and after an hour left without writing a single line. He told no one why. He just never returned. But those who know say this: she does not haunt. She does not call for vengeance. She does not demand remembrance, because the land does it for her. Every time a fox crosses a field with eyes too clever. Every time a daughter speaks truth in a room full of men. Every time a people pushed down rise again with nothing but memory in their hands. That is where she sleeps, in moments, in echoes, in quiet defiance. Once a year, no one agrees exactly when, women gather at the hill. They wear no crowns, no jewelry, only moss-colored cloaks and mud on their fingers. They sit in a circle not quite touching, and they share stories, not of war, but of endurance. A birth that took 2 days, a field tilled after frost, a child taught to read even as the rains came. They do not speak Boudica's name, they do not need to. The wind does that for them. And when they leave, they do not look back, because the hill is not a shrine, it is a mirror. And once you've looked inside, you carry it with you. So, Where does Boudica sleep? In the sound of bare feet on wet grass, in the hush before a storm breaks, in the first breath after a scream, in the calm after fury, not in marble, not in statues, not in books that misspelled her. She sleeps where no road leads, where no empire dares pave. She sleeps in the land, and the land remembers. The Romans wrote about her, because they had to. You do not walk away from a woman like Boudica and remain silent. Even when you win, even when you rebuild the cities she burned, replant the fields her warriors trampled, and smooth over the cracks in your imperial image, you still write. Because the silence she left behind speaks too loudly. And so they picked up their pens, their chisels, their imperial voices, and they tried to contain her in stone and story. But the strange thing about Boudica is, she does not fit. Not in lines, not in borders, not even in memory you try to control. The first to mention her by name was Tacitus, a senator, not a soldier, not someone who saw her, nor heard her voice, nor smelled the smoke at Londinium, but someone who understood the power of story and the danger of letting a woman like her go untold. He had access to first-hand recollections. His father-in-law, Agricola, had served in Britannia during the time of rebellion. And so Tacitus took what he knew, or what he thought he knew, and shaped it into something that looked like history, but read like a warning. He gave Boudica words, a voice, a battlefield speech. She is tall, he wrote. Her hair falls to her hips. Her voice is fierce. She spoke of liberty, of land, of how Rome stole what was not theirs. It was, by Roman standards, a compelling performance, but still, a performance, not a person. Cassius Dio came later. Another Roman voice, another scroll, another attempt. He never saw her either, but he gave her new details. Golden torques, a chariot with scythes, a voice that pierced through the clangor of war. He painted her as both majestic and monstrous, regal in bearing, ruthless in action. And just like that, the woman became a myth, but not the myth her people told. His Boudica was wild, ferocious, driven by grief to chaos. She led an army of barbarians, shouting vengeance, desecrating temples, killing without restraint. She became a specter, not a leader, and behind every line you could feel the subtext. This is what happens when women lead. This is why Rome must endure. What they wrote was not false, but it was incomplete. They wrote of fire, but not of the cold nights before it. They wrote of battle cries, but not of lullabies. They wrote of rebellion, but not of the bruises on her daughter's skin. They forgot, or chose not to see, the woman who sat at the hearth, the mother who braided hair, the queen who once believed in compromise, because that version was harder to defeat. And yet in their writing, something slipped through, something unintentional. In the precision of their records, in the repetition of her name, in the fact that they could not stop speaking of her, something else emerged. Fear, not the trembling kind, the respectful kind, the kind that lingers in the back of your throat when you realize your opponent was not only fierce, but right. The kind that creeps in when you begin to wonder, what if she hadn't lost? What if she'd had just a little more time, a little more strategy, a little more mercy from the gods? Would Rome have fallen here in the fog and heather? It's in the details, in how they try to explain the scale of her rebellion. 70,000. Roman citizens dead, they say. 3 cities razed. The province destabilized for years. They recount it with horror, yes, but also with awe. They blame her for destruction, but they never call her weak. Not once. They call her unnatural, unfeminine, uncontrolled. But never forgettable they couldn't, because while they wrote to bury her, they ended up building her shrine. They didn't mean to. They meant to make her a cautionary tale. To say, this is what happens when the wild are left unchecked, when a woman speaks too loudly, when a mother dares to fight like a man. But over time, something strange happened. The people reading those words, they began to hear her, to see her, not as a threat, but as a mirror, as a figure who rose when everything was taken from her, who demanded to be heard, not as a symbol, but as a sovereign, who chose fire not for power, but for dignity, and so the story split. In marble, she was the rebel queen. In memory, she was something more. She became a figure of quiet defiance, a voice in the wind, a reason to remember that some battles are worth losing, if only to remind the world they were ever fought. Even the Romans, with all their roads and records, could not erase her, because they tried too hard to name her, and once named, she stayed. Some scholars now debate the accuracy of their accounts. They argue over timelines, details, whether the scythes on her chariot were real or metaphor, whether she really spoke those words Tacitus gave her. But they miss the deeper truth. That, when Rome wrote her down, she wrote herself back up, line by line, into legend. And the most curious thing? Today, outside of textbooks, few remember Catus Decianus, the Roman official who humiliated her. Few know the name of Suetonius Paulinus, the general who defeated her. Few can recite the laws that invalidated her daughter's rights. But Boudica, even mispronounced, even tangled in myth, she is still spoken, still studied, still felt, because some figures slip through cracks in history and grow in the roots beneath it, and no amount of stone can outlast a story like that. Courage is not always loud. It does not always gallop through fire or shout across battlefields. Sometimes it waits, breathes. Sometimes it is the silence between two choices, a breath taken before a door opens, a hand held in the dark, a name whispered, not because it's powerful, but because it still matters. And if we look back across the long shadow of time, we see courage changing shape, not disappearing, not dimming, but adapting, stretching itself across centuries, slipping into new skins. This is how Boudica survived, not just in history, but in evolution, in memory that moved with the world instead of fighting it. When the swords were put away and the cities rebuilt, and the fires forgotten by those who could afford to forget, her story did not end. It simply shifted. What began as a battle cry became a bedtime story. What once roared turned into a lullaby, not weaker, but quieter. And in that quiet, something powerful took root. Because courage, you see, is not one thing, it never was. We often imagine bravery as a single moment, a charge, a defiance, a last stand. But that's just the surface. Beneath it lies something softer, something slower, the courage to remember, to carry on, to grieve in public, to raise children after a war you didn't choose, to keep telling the story, even when your voice shakes. And stories, like courage, change too. The Romans called her a savage. Later, she was painted as a queen draped in righteous fury, then a rebel, then a martyr, then a myth. But through each version, her courage remained, sometimes sharpened, sometimes softened, always there. And if you listen closely, you'll notice what people emphasize in her tale often says more about them than about her. In one century, she is dangerous, too bold, too angry, too free. In another, she is inspiring, a woman who dared when others fled. In yet another, she is maternal, protective, defending her daughters, not just her throne. The shape of her story bends to the times, and that's not failure. That's survival. Because the stories that last are the ones that know how to listen. Picture her courage not as a sword, but as a thread, thin, bright, unbreakable, winding through generations, changing color, changing texture, but never snapping. It passes through the hands of weavers and warriors, mothers and mourners, teachers and teenagers. It is picked up again each time someone says this isn't fair and chooses to speak anyway. There is an old saying among storytellers: courage is a candle, passed, not burned. That's what happened with Boudica's story. It was not handed down in fire, but in warmth, not shouted across rooftops, but shared across kitchens. In tea poured for someone grieving. In a book gifted to a daughter who doesn't yet know she's strong. In the decision to teach children all versions of history, not just the tidy ones. Even now, people argue over what she truly stood for. Was it vengeance? Justice? Freedom? They debate her tactics, her strategies, even her name. But the shape of courage is not found in certainty. It's found in reflection, in willingness to ask, what would I have done? And in the choice to carry her forward, however incomplete the story may be. A young girl once heard the story of Boudica and asked, did she win? And the storyteller, old and soft-voiced, said, no, but she was right. The girl thought for a while, then said, so she did win, and maybe in that moment she did. The shape of courage isn't always armor. Sometimes it's vulnerability, the choice to keep loving after loss, to keep hoping after betrayal, to rebuild when everything around you still smells like smoke. We remember Boudica not because she was perfect or because she succeeded, but because she stood up, because she said no, because she reminded the world that a woman's voice can shake an empire, even if just for a moment. And that moment echoed through ink, through legend, through lullaby. So yes, stories change. That's what keeps them alive. And yes, courage shifts shape. That's what keeps it near. But some stories, like some kinds of bravery, stay close to the root, to the soil, to the quiet fire beneath the words. And as long as someone is willing to sit in that quiet, the story will continue. There are stories we inherit without ever being told them. They come to us not through ink or proclamation, but in gestures, in pauses, in the way our mothers hold silence when a certain name is spoken, in the way grandmothers wrap herbs in old cloth and call it protection, not potion, in the way a girl learns to listen to the wind, not for weather, but for memory. And for the daughters of Boudica, this inheritance was not riches, not even victory. It was something more enduring, the shape of strength, the strength to carry what had been broken and to pass it on, not with ceremony, but with care. Her daughters did not raise armies. They raised gardens. They raised other people's children. They raised questions in rooms where no one had asked before. They did not ride into fire, but they walked through the world with something steady in their eyes, a kind of knowing that does not need explanation. And the people around them noticed, even if they could not name it, even if they never knew why. The sight of these women, planting heather near burned-out ruins or standing quietly beside graves, made their throats tighten for reasons they couldn't explain. The elder daughter, after the fire, moved north. She married no one. She spoke little, but those who lived nearby began to send their children to her, especially the ones who asked too many questions, or cried too much, or refused to be still. To them she gave stories, not all about her mother. Some were about trees that never dropped their leaves, or rivers that forgot their names, or foxes that remembered what humans forgot. But always, tucked inside, was something else. Truth, wrapped in quiet, warmed in patience, a lesson not shouted but planted like seed. The younger daughter, wild-eyed, softer-spoken, stayed near the coast. She lived in a hut built with her own hands, among rocks and wind. No one knew what she did during the day, but the sick began to recover when she visited. And when someone died, she was often the first to arrive, not to offer answers, only to sit and wait, and sometimes hum. A song no one remembered learning, but everyone seemed to know. Over time, others followed. Women who were not daughters by blood, but by belief. They took up weaving, healing, walking. They did not call themselves warriors, but they resisted in ways sharper than swords. They told stories to frighten children that did not end in triumph. But in truth, they spoke up in council halls where women were expected to keep their eyes low. They tended fields the empire forgot. They remembered, and through that remembering, they preserved something far more sacred than land. They preserved her shape. In the centuries after, the name changed. Boudica, Boadicea, muddled in manuscripts, mispronounced in ballads, mistranslated on monuments. But the thread, the core of what it meant, remained whole, even when hidden. In a village near the fens, a woman once carved strange symbols into the handles of her tools: spirals, horse hooves, crescent moons. When asked what they meant, she only smiled. "They keep me steady," she said. No one asked again. But that winter, when the river rose, her house was the only one not touched by flood. Elsewhere, a child born under thunder was named Breda. She never heard the story of the queen directly. No one read it to her, but one night in a dream she saw a woman with tangled hair and eyes like the night sea. The woman knelt down and handed her a seed. No words, just the seed. Breda woke up and began writing poems. None of them rhymed. All of them spoke of fire wrapped in cloth. In a city where history had hardened into marble, a teacher began including Boudica in her lessons, not as a rebel, but as a mother. A woman pushed too far, a voice too full of truth to be silenced without consequence. Parents complained, administrators frowned, but the students listened. And one by one, they wrote their own versions, none of them the same, all of them loyal. This is how legacy lives, not in law, in echoes that change with each mouth, but somehow keep singing the same note, a note of resilience, of rootedness, of refusal. And so the thread passed on, from cradle to field, from ink-stained hands to earth-stained hands, from hearth to hall, and back again. And somewhere, in the turning of generations, that name, however misremembered, became not a noun, but a verb. To Boudica, something. To stand. To speak. To not yield, even when the cost is comfort. That is what her daughters gave us. Not a story with a single shape, but a living, breathing act of remembering. A name stitched into the seams of ordinary days. A name that does not belong to history, but to the hands that keep holding it. There are stories we grow into. We do not choose them. They do not arrive all at once. They begin like a whisper, carried by someone's grandmother, echoed in an old book, glimpsed in a museum you didn't mean to visit. And somehow, slowly, they begin to live inside you. Boudica's story is one of those. You do not have to know every date, every city, every battle. You only need to feel a pause in your breath when you hear her name, because something in you recognizes it, not as legend, as memory, but what truly is the lesson she offers us now? What does a queen from 2,000 years ago say to the world of electric lights and concrete towers? Perhaps this: that the way we carry ourselves matters, that the way we choose, every day, to rise quietly, kindly, clearly, is an act of resistance all its own. Boudica's courage came in fire, in fury, in the thunder of hooves and the roar of justice long denied. But not all courage must burn so bright. Some courage, perhaps most, burns low and steady, like a coal under ash, like a light in a window that says someone is still here, someone is still holding on. That's the quiet flame, and it is no less powerful for its gentleness. It takes courage to speak in rooms where your voice trembles, to keep working through grief, to raise a child without certainty, to age with grace when the world only celebrates youth, to forgive without forgetting, to hold your own hand when no one else will. And these quiet forms of courage, invisible, unsung, are what keep history turning, not heroes in bronze, but people with soft eyes and stronger spines than anyone guesses. Boudica's name is carved in stone now, but that's not where she lives. She lives in the woman who stays late too. Lock up the library so others can read a little longer. In the nurse who holds a stranger's hand through pain. In the teacher who refuses to erase difficult stories for easier ones. In the man who listens when a woman says no and believes her. In the child who asks, why do they have more than us? And in the parent who answers, let's talk about that. The lessons she gives are not about how to fight. They're about why we fight and for whom. They're about dignity, about the sacredness of saying, we deserve better, not louder, truer. To carry, her flame is not to be angry all the time. It is to know when anger serves love and when silence speaks louder than any scream. It is to ask, again and again, what kind of world am I helping build? With each word, each glance, each kindness. She teaches us that not every battle is on horseback. Some are at kitchen tables, in hospital waiting rooms, on sidewalks, in voting booths, in broken conversations that try again, in letters never sent, but written all the same. And she reminds us, you do not need permission to care. You do not need permission to speak. You do not need permission to believe that your life is worthy of respect, not from an empire, not from a crowd, not even from history, only from yourself. That's the quiet flame, the one that doesn't go out, even when you feel forgotten, the one that burns when you're tired, but not done, the one that lives in every person who has ever whispered, I'm still here. So if tonight you find yourself wondering what good your voice is, if the world feels too loud, too cruel, too fast, if your light feels small, remember this. There is power in presence, in breath, in showing up again, in choosing to be soft and strong in a world that often asks you to be neither. Some legacies are loud, some are carved in marble. But Boudica's? Hers is passed hand to hand, heart to heart. A lesson not shouted but offered, not taught but remembered, not enforced but lived. Every time someone stands with someone else. Every time someone says, this is not fair, and I will not turn away. That is the fire. Not grand, but enough. Always enough. Before the fire, before they called you queen, before the roads filled with dust and soldiers and the smell of burning roofs, there was a quiet. And in that quiet, you were simply a woman. A name passed down in laughter, not in legend. A daughter of a tribe, of a river, of a place where the sky felt close enough to touch. You were born not into conquest, but into rhythm, the rhythm of tending and teaching, gathering and giving, of holding small hands, of waking with birdsong and sleeping beside a crackling fire, not because the world was at war, but because the day had ended. That was the woman you were. You were not raised to raise armies. You were raised to raise voices, small, curious ones that asked impossible questions about trees and stars. You were not taught to wield weapons. You were taught to read weather by the shape of the wind, to gather herbs for belly aches and birthing pains, to sing the songs that helped the crops grow. You were taught that leadership was not about being feared. It was about being remembered, gently, not because you ruled, but because you remained. Through storms, through bad harvests, through silence that stretched longer than it should have. You remained. You had a husband. He was not perfect, neither were you. But you shared the kind of love that does not need to be poetic to be powerful. He called you little fire when you were angry. You called him stoneface when he worried too much. Together, you laughed more than you cried, and when you cried, you did it together. And when he died, when Rome took not just his land, but the protection his title gave you, you did not break. You bent. You bent, because you were still the woman from before the fire, and that woman knew how to bend without snapping. You had daughters. 2, born under oak trees, near the riverbank. They learned to walk by holding onto your skirts. They learned to speak by hearing you say their names with a smile. They learned to dream because you never told them not to. They knew the scent of your hair better than they knew the constellations. They knew your hands, strong and calloused, but always open. They knew your voice, steady, even when the world was not. Before they hurt your daughters, you still believed in reason. You still believed in negotiation. You still believed, perhaps foolishly, that even empires could be spoken to like men. You wore your grief quietly, like a shawl. You did not scream. You simply stood. Your people came to you not because they needed war, but because they needed witnessing. Someone to say, I see what they did. Someone to say, this is not just, you never wanted to be a figure carved in bronze. You wanted to be a mother in peace. But when that peace was stolen, you rose, not because it was in your nature, but because there was no one else left to do it. And even then, even in rebellion, you carried the woman you had been. You remembered how to braid hair with tenderness, how to prepare meals with your daughters, how to speak in a voice that soothed as much as it stirred, because you did not erase your past to become who you needed to be. You carried it, all of it, and that is why they followed you, not just because of rage, but because of memory. You were the woman who helped birth a child in the middle of winter, the woman who once stopped a marriage because she sensed a girl's fear, the woman who knew the names of every elder oak in the wood and said hello to them like neighbors, the woman who still sometimes sang to herself when walking through the heather. And now, the world sees only the flame. But we remember the hearth, the quiet fire that warmed, not burned, the fire that came after years of tending, not in spite of them, because of them. So let us remember you again, just this once. Not in bronze, not on battlefields, but in the early morning mist, in the softness of wool, in the hush that comes when the story is almost over, and someone finally asks, who was she really before the fire? And someone else answers, she was a woman who loved and was loved, who tended first, then rose, and still burns quietly in every woman who does the same. It's evening now, not just in the story, but in the world outside your window. The light is fading, the air has softened, and everything seems to slow, just a little. You've walked a long road through time with her, with Boudica, from laughter to loss, from fire to field, from the woman she was to the legend she became. And now, before you sleep, she has one more moment to give. You've heard the battles. You've stood beside her as she rose, as she fell. But perhaps before we end, we should walk with her one last time, not on a road of rebellion, but on a path of peace. Back to the quiet places, to the land where she once lived, before and after the fire, to the wild heather and the hush of forgotten hills, to where memory does not shout, but lingers. Imagine it with me now. You are walking. The earth is soft beneath your feet. The heather brushes your ankles. There is a low wind, not cold, but cool enough to remind you that the world is turning. The sky above you is vast and pale, lavender stretched wide like a quilt, and in that vastness there is no noise, only breath, only the slow rhythm of your steps. She is not far, but she does not appear, not as a ghost, not as a queen. She is the rustle in the grass, the flicker of a bird just out of sight, the warmth in your chest that you can't quite name. She is not waiting for you. She's always been here. There is a hill, not high but steep enough that your breath catches a little when you climb it. At the top, there is a single tree, bent by wind but unbroken, and at its base you sit. Not because someone told you to, but because your body understands. This is where endings belong. And from here, you see it all. The valleys she once walked, the rivers that once mirrored her face, the towns rebuilt again and again. You see paths that were hers, now worn smooth by time, and in the distance, you see nothing at all. Just mist, just possibility, and in that nothing there is peace. There are no drums here, no shouts, only heartbeat, only memory. only the gentle truth that all things end, but not all things are lost. Say goodbye, if you wish. Say it softly. Say it with breath, not voice. Because she doesn't need farewell in the way that people do. She was never here to be owned, only to be remembered, only to be felt. You might place your hand on the earth. You might close your eyes. You might say nothing at all. All of it is right, because what matters is not the form of the farewell. It is the fact that you made the journey, that you stayed, that you listened. And in doing so, you let her live again, not as a statue, but as a woman, not as a warrior, but as a whisper. And perhaps as you begin to rise, you feel something warm in your palm. You open it slowly, nothing there, and yet, a weight, a presence, a flame, not burning, just glowing. Quietly. It's not hers, it's yours now. She has given it to you, a small, quiet flame, not of war, but of memory, to carry, to share, to keep lit, even when the night is long. So you walk down the hill again, not alone, never alone now, though path looks different, but that's only because you are different. You carry a name, not to shout it, to remember it, to let it shape how you move, how you speak, how you choose, not with rage, with rhythm. And tonight, as you lie in your bed, let the weight of this story settle over you, not heavily, not like armor, like a blanket, woven from all the voices that came before. Let the wind in the trees be her voice. Let the warmth in your chest be her light. Let the silence be not emptiness, but arrival. You do not need to dream of chariots. You do not need to dream at all. Just rest, just breathe, just carry her gently, in thought, in kindness, in the way you forgive yourself for not being louder, faster, more certain. You are enough, and so is she. Good night, Boudica. Good night, listener. Thank you for walking this path. Sleep well, and let the flame glow on.